Well, hello everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome to Locker Room Talk. Are you wondering who's really watching out for you? Who's watching over the spending of your tax dollars, making sure that every dollar that you earn that goes into state coffers is spent wisely and efficiently? Well, you've come to the right place, because here at the John Locke Foundation, that's exactly what our mission is. We are dedicated to making North Carolina first in freedom. And a key component of making North Carolina first in freedom is making sure that tax dollars are spent wisely. Now, there's a couple of things going on right now that we wanted to update you on, because we do have allies in this effort in the General Assembly and in the Governor's office. Joining me to talk about what's happening right now are two of my colleagues. First of all, Becki Gray, Vice President for Outreach for the John Locke Foundation, and Rick Henderson, who is Managing Editor of Carolina Journal. Thanks for being with me.
Sure. Thanks.
Okay, so Becki, we've got something going on in budget negotiations right now that really is a positive sign about the emphasis on protecting taxpayer dollars. What's happening?
Right. Well, the first thing that in these budget negotiations that they've decided on, is the amount of money they're going to spend. And it was very good news when they came out with a figure of $735 million.
$21.7 billion.
Yes, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But the thing that's significant about that, Donna, is that is 3% more than what we spent last year. Now, what that 3% number indicates is that is about what we would see with the growth of population plus inflation. So what we really have is a self-imposed Taxpayer Protection Act that the General Assembly in these budget negotiations have imposed on themselves. We don't have a statute that requires that. We don't have a constitutional amendment that requires that. But this is something that's been self-imposed by this conservative, fiscally responsible General Assembly.
Well, that sounds like really good news that we've got some
news.
Fiscal stewards who are taking this very seriously.
Right, and actually the last several budget cycles that we've had, we have seen this self-imposed restriction of spending, which is exactly the direction that we believe that the government needs to go in, and that this elected body, the General Assembly, and this governor have imposed on themselves.
Now, Becki, the John Locke Foundation has been writing about this, urging lawmakers for years to really be restrained in their spending and make sure that if there is government growth, that it's going to core services. Is that what you're seeing and hearing in these negotiations?
It's exactly what it is. And really prioritizing where that money goes and putting at this point, it is a self-imposed restriction so that it's not wide open, so that what the budget really reflects is a list of needs, not wants, and it also really keeps them focused on the core function of government, understanding, of course, that the better use of taxpayer money is to put it back in their pockets for them to choose how they want to invest and they want to spend their money, encourage businesses to create more jobs and get this economic recovery that we're seeing, that we have seen in the last 5 years.
So, Rick, while all of this is going on in the budget negotiations, there is something separate, a more formal Taxpayer Protection Act that is also working its way through the General Assembly. It's been passed by the Senate. We don't know yet whether or not the House will buy into this. Tell us about the Taxpayer Protection Act.
The actual bill is Senate Bill 607, and it's a combination of three measures that were wrapped up together by the Senate. There were going to be three separate constitutional amendments that would appear on the ballot next year. The Senate decided to combine them into one single amendment, and the amendment would do three things. First of all, it would set a constitutional cap on income tax rates at 5%, personal income tax rates. Currently, the personal income tax is 5.75%, so this would actually reduce the limit of taxation right now. The constitutional limit currently is 10%, so this would cut that level in half. The second thing it would do is it would require every year for a certain percentage of the general fund collections to be put into a rainy day fund until that rainy day fund builds to 12.5% of the general fund. And so what that would do is that would give us a cushion in case we had a recession or some natural disaster or other emergency that required spending from the rainy day fund. And the rainy day fund itself requires supermajorities to get that money out. So there's some protection there that they can't just go in and spend that if they decide that the rainy day fund's getting bigger than they want and they have some other things that they would like to do. The third thing, and the one that is probably the most controversial, is that it would actually impose a constitutional spending limit on the General Assembly. This is a provision that is compared to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights or Tabor in Colorado, even though it's not the same. But what it would do is it would simply say that spending in the general fund can only grow by the growth in inflation and population on a year-to-year basis. And if the General Assembly wants to spend more than that, then they have to get a 2/3 vote in both chambers for that to take place. So it's not a constitutional limit, but it's a statutory limit.
Okay, so
I think one thing
you
that's kind of
have to be excited
significant-
about this.
I'm very excited about it, but here's the other thing that I think is important. All three of these provisions that Rick has talked about, these are not new ideas. These aren't new ideas to North Carolinians. As we mentioned just a few minutes ago, the Taxpayer Protection Act, this limit of the growth of government, has been in place for the last 5 years, the last 2 going into 3 budget cycles. So this is something that we're doing anyway. The limit on the amount of money that can come out of personal income is currently 10% in the state constitution. This would just lower it to 5%. So this notion of limiting how much your personal income can be taxed is already part of our constitution. And then the third thing, the requirement that money be put into a rainy day fund, there's already a requirement that with certain triggers that money be put aside. This just strengthens it and makes savings a higher priority for North Carolinians. So these 3 ideas, the only thing that is really different about this, I mean some of the details, the only thing that's really different about it is these are things we're doing anyway. This would just put it into our state constitution so that when the pendulum swings back, when we perhaps don't have a fiscally conservative leadership in this state, there are some things that are put into place that North Carolinians want. I also think it's really important to note that these provisions would be voted on by the people of North Carolina. So this is not something that government's going to do. This is something that we would have these self-impositions placed on ourselves.
That's key, because if this makes it all the way through the General Assembly, makes it onto the ballot, then we would actually vote yes or no.
And I think it's important to note, too, as we watch this go through the General Assembly, as you mentioned, this is passed in the Senate, it still rests in the House. The only decision the General Assembly is making is whether or not to put this at a vote to the people. The General Assembly is not deciding that we're going to have a constitutionally imposed Taxpayer Protection Act. All they're doing is saying, we think that the North Carolina taxpayers ought to make these decisions.
Now, there is opposition to this,
Yes.
for sure. Now, Rick, the people who are opposed to it always bring up Colorado. They say this was done in Colorado a few years ago and that it did not work. Some people even call it a disaster in Colorado. You used to live there and work there. Tell us about the difference between what went on in Colorado and what we're proposing here.
There are several major differences, but the big one is that the Colorado Tabor requires a vote of the people for any increase in spending or tax rates by any level of government above the inflation plus population rate limits. That's the big one. The number 2 thing, and the thing that really caused Colorado problems, is that there is a spending ratchet in Tabor. And the way this thing works is that if you have a recession, as they had in 2001, and your general fund collections go down, that resets where the baseline for your budget is the next year. So you can't use reserves to build spending back up to previous levels. What basically happened, another difference as well, is that they do require certain portions of the general fund budget to be spent on certain things, like education, like pensions, like compensation for firefighters and transportation. So what happens when you have some sort of recession like that and the spending limit goes down, all of a sudden you can't really you can't spend money on all sorts of other things. And so this rule in Colorado caused a problem which they had to remedy with a vote of the people to actually spend money that they had just sitting there that they were going to have to refund to taxpayers. Now we might think it's always better to let taxpayers keep more of what they earn, but if the alternative is we're going to give you back your money, but then a couple of years from now we got to raise your taxes again in the middle of a recession, that's not a good thing. And so there are a lot of safeguards in the North Carolina Taxpayer Protection Act that would prevent the kinds of calamities. And there were some calamities in Colorado that happened with Tabor. However, the one thing about it is, Democrat or Republican in Colorado, if you talk about taking away people's vote on Tabor, you're going to get kicked out of office. That is the most popular part of this measure by far, but it's not in North Carolina's.
I think there's another message there, too, in that Colorado's already done this. And as Rick just described, there were some glitches, there were some hiccups. We can learn from that. We can improve that. And the other thing I think that is important to mention is, as far as I know, now Rick used to live there, but even with this Tabor thing, even with all this criticism, as I understand it, there are schools that are open, teachers are reporting for work, there are universities in Colorado, they're providing a well-skilled workforce, there are roads and bridges in Colorado that people are able to drive on and get to work, and commerce is taking place in Colorado. So all of these things of, oh my gosh, this is terrible, I'm not sure that that's really going to be the worst thing in the world. Am I right?
They actually did survive and are now thriving now if the economy has rebounded. But yes, there were issues and there were glitches and there were problems because the areas of government that they couldn't fund because of other limitations voters put on spending had some issues, but they were able to work around it. Now, I do think the big advantage with North Carolina's provision is that, first of all, it is something that the General Assembly can get around without having to go back to the people, because you know how long it takes to get an election on the ballot in North Carolina. You know how long these sorts of things take. So if you have a genuine emergency, you've got a problem here. And so this is, we get around that.
Well, and General Assembly members are elected to represent the people. So, right. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me that they would be entrusted with making those decisions on behalf of us.
Yeah. Becki Gray, Rick Henderson, thank you so much. So these are just two of the key issues that we are watching right now going on in the General Assembly. We will have another edition of Locker Room Talk to give you an update about that. But in the meantime, please do log on to carolinajournal.com, johnlocke.org, and follow us on social media. You can find us on Twitter, also on Facebook. For Rick Henderson, Becki Gray, I'm Donna Martinez. Thank you for joining us for Locker Room Talk.